Imagine your boss fires you tomorrow. Not because, you stopped doing your job or because the company is downsizing.
Right.
You're fired because the post office lost an envelope with a single form inside. Or, I don't know, maybe an automated email just went straight to your spam folder.
It sounds completely
It
absurd.
really does. But for millions of Americans relying on food assistance, that exact scenario isn't some metaphor. It's a built-in bureaucratic feature called churn, and it is literally taking food out of people's refrigerators.
Yeah, and it completely upends how we traditionally think about social safety nets. Like, we generally assume that if you meet the criteria, if you actually need the help, the system provides it.
Right.
But the reality of administering these massive programs is that eligibility is really only half the battle. Surviving the paperwork is the other half.
For sure. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to pull back the curtain on the massive structural shifts happening right now to SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We're stepping in as your personal policy analyst today, looking closely at the fallout from the one big, beautiful bill act that passed back in July of 2025.
And, the timing of this discussion is just critical. I mean, we're
Yeah.
sitting here in May 2026, which means we aren't talking about projections or political debates anymore.
Yeah, it's happening right now.
Exactly. We are looking at the real-time implementation of a law that has fundamentally rewritten the rules of the game for states, for caseworkers, and obviously for millions of participants.
And just a quick note before we jump in, we want to make it super clear that this deep dive is strictly an impartial policy analysis. We're just looking at the mechanics of the law, the raw data, and the real-world implementation. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints or taking any political sides here.
Absolutely. Just the facts.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get to the administrative hurdles, like the churn we mentioned, we have to look at the baseline changes. And the acronym driving everything in this new landscape is ABIWD.
Yeah, ABAWD. That is the central pivot point of the new legislation. So ABID stands for able-bodied adults without dependents.
Right.
And for decades, SNP has had this baseline expectation for this specific group. Basically, to receive benefits for more than 3 months within any 36-month period, you have to prove you are working or volunteering or in an approved job training program for 80 hours a month.
Which averages out to, about 20 hours a week?
Exactly, about 20 hours a week.
So, the work requirement itself isn't a new invention. What the 2025 legislation did was radically expand the definition of who actually falls into that able-bodied category, right? Like stripping away exemptions that used to protect some very specific populations.
Precisely. The legislative logic behind the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was standardization. The argument from the sponsors was that by casting a wider net, the government could, encourage workforce participation during a period of labor shortages.
Right, getting more people working.
Yeah, but in practice, standardizing those requirements meant pulling millions of older, often marginalized individuals into this highly rigorous tracking system.
Yeah, let's look at the age bracket expansion first, because the leap is staggering. For years, the ABAW work requirements capped out at age 54, because the assumption was that by your mid-50s, if you were out of the workforce, you probably had compounding physical limitations or, barriers to entry.
Right.
But the new law pushed that age limit all the way up to 64.
Which fundamentally changes the nature of the requirement. I mean, think about a 62-year-old former construction worker with bad knees. They might not qualify for federal disability, which, by the way, requires meeting a very strict, legally defined medical threshold.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly hard to get.
Exactly. But at the same time, they are incredibly unlikely to be hired for a 20-hour-a-week retail job. Yet under these new rules, if they can't secure that employment, the burden falls entirely on them to navigate the medical system out of pocket to get a doctor's note proving they have a physical exemption.
And it's not just older Americans either. The bill removed wholesale exemptions for veterans, for people experiencing homelessness, and even former foster youth aging out of the system.
It's a huge shift.
It really is. I was reading through the implementation guidelines, and the practical application of this is just mind-boggling. Like, how does someone living out of their car consistently document 80 hours of volunteer work when they don't even have a mailing address?
The short answer is they often don't. That is the stark reality of it. The intent of the law may have been to standardize, but the mechanism itself requires a level of stability that homeless populations, by definition, just do not possess.
Because tracking volunteer hours means you need things like internet access, right?
Internet access, transportation to approved sites, and supervisors to sign off on physical timesheets.
Wow. And then you add in the changes for parents and caregivers. The old rule felt pretty intuitive to me. Like if you were the primary caregiver for a child under 18, you were exempt from the 20-hour work mandate because obviously raising a minor is recognized as labor.
Right.
But the new bill dropped that age threshold to 14.
Yeah. The argument presented by the bill sponsors was that high schoolers do not require daytime supervision. So in theory, once a child turns 14, the parents' daytime hours are freed up, which allows them to enter the workforce or join a training program.
Okay, so if we put all these demographic shifts together, the compounding effect is intense. Let's trace a specific scenario here. Say I am a 60-year-old military veteran, and I have primary custody of my 15-year-old grandson.
Okay.
Before July 2025, I was insulated from the ABWD work mandate for 3 completely separate reasons, right? I was over 54, I had veteran status, and I was caring for a minor. Under this new legislation, do all 3 of those shields vanish simultaneously?
Every single one. Yeah.
Wait, really?
Yes. Your age exemption is gone because the limit is now 64. Your veteran exemption is completely gone. And because your grandson is over 14, your caregiver exemption is gone.
That is wild.
So literally overnight, you transition from being securely eligible for assistance to having this 90-day ticking clock to find 20 hours of work a week, or you lose your food budget entirely.
So the burden of proof is totally inverted. You're essentially guilty of being ineligible until you can prove otherwise.
Pretty much.
But even if that 60-year-old veteran manages to find a job or a volunteer gig, their fate might actually just come down to their zip code, right? Because the new rules didn't just change the demographics, they completely rewrote the geographic map.
That's a great point. Geography has always been the safety valve for work requirements. Historically, the federal government acknowledged that demanding people work 20 hours a week is irrational if the local economy has collapsed.
Right, if there are literally no jobs. Exactly. So state governors used to be able to request waivers to pause the ABAWD requirements in specific counties or cities or tribal areas that were experiencing severe economic downturns or high unemployment.
But the One Big Beautiful Bill Act placed an incredibly severe cap on those waivers. The new rule states that an area can only qualify for a waiver if the local unemployment rate explicitly exceeds 10%.
And what's fascinating here is understanding why 10% is such a disruptive number. Economists generally consider an economy to be at full employment when the unemployment rate is around 4 or 5%.
Okay.
So a 10% unemployment rate isn't just a tough job market, that is a localized economic depression. By setting the bar that high, the legislation intentionally designed a system where almost no community can qualify for relief.
I pulled the data on this, and the contrast is just wild. So before this bill passed, 31 different states and territories utilized full or partial geographic waivers to protect participants in struggling towns. Under the new 10% threshold, as of right now in May 2026, exactly 8 counties in the entire United States qualify for a waiver.
Wow. 8 counties out of more than 3,000.
Yeah, it effectively abolishes the waiver system. I mean, states are now mandated to enforce these strict work requirements essentially everywhere. It strips local governments of their ability to respond to regional economic nuance, like, say, a factory closing down in a rural town.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because states had to overhaul their massive legacy computer systems to track all these new age brackets and geographic limits, the rollout has been incredibly fragmented.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the federal mandate started checking compliance in December 2025, but states like California, D.C., Illinois, and Nevada had to beg for extensions into early 2026 just to reprogram their software.
Which creates bizarre jurisdictional anomalies.
Right. Take Pennsylvania, for example. Because of how the data coding worked out, the new, stricter work requirements are currently being enforced across the entire state, except for the cities of Lancaster and Lebanon, where the implementation is delayed until September 2026.
That is crazy.
You literally have situations where living on the north side of a street means you keep your benefits, and living on the south side means you lose them.
And think about what that means for a state caseworker. They're sitting in a centralized call center trying to enforce federal law, but they have to constantly cross-reference these microscopic, hyperlocal timelines.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a recipe for administrative chaos.
Which brings us right back to the concept of churn. We've established the new hurdles, but churn is what happens when you actually trip over them. As a policy concept, churn is distinct from becoming legitimately ineligible, right?
Entirely distinct. So if you get a promotion at work and your income goes up, you lose your benefits because you no longer need them.
Right.
That is the system working as intended. Churn is when you are fully eligible. You're poor enough, you're working the required hours, you meet every single legal standard, but your case is closed anyway due to an administrative paperwork failure.
And the data we have from the Urban Institute really paints a grim picture. In 2024, before these stricter rules even hit, nearly 1 in 4 working-age adults in families receiving SNAP reported some kind of interruption in their benefits.
That's 24%.
Yeah. And worse, 1 in 8 working-age adults completely lost their benefits specifically because of problems recertifying on time.
To understand the mechanism behind those numbers, you really have to look at the recertification process. So every 6 to 12 months, a participant receives a notice.
Right.
The state initiates a 30-day window where the participant must submit updated pay stubs, utility bills, housing costs, and often complete a mandatory phone interview. If any single piece of that puzzle is missing on day 30, their EBT card, the physical debit card they use at the grocery store checkout, simply declines. The funds are cut off.
And when you look at why people miss that deadline, it's rarely negligence. According to the data, 40% of those who experienced churn said they simply didn't have enough time to gather the required documents. And even more alarming, 32% said they never received the notice in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, if a caseworker makes a typo entering your apartment number, or if you had to move suddenly to a cheaper rental and the mail forwarding delays your letter by 2 weeks, that 30-day clock is still ticking.
Wow.
Or if you work a shift job and the state call center has a 4-hour hold time for the mandatory interview, you have to choose between keeping your actual job or keeping your food assistance.
It's exactly like my car insurance analogy from earlier. If my auto pay fails because my credit card expired, I get a grace period. It's annoying, but I fix it. In the SNAP key system, the penalty for a missed piece of mail isn't a late fee. The penalty is losing an average of $550 in food purchasing power for the year.
That's devastating.
And now, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act just shoved millions of older Americans and veterans into this exact high-stakes recertification meat grinder.
Yeah, every time the state touches a case, whether it's to verify those newly required 20 hours of work or to process a newly required medical exemption, the statistical probability of churn skyrockets. The more interaction required, the more opportunities for this system to break down.
Now, obviously, this is devastating for the individual. But what blew my mind in the research is that this isn't just an individual crisis. Churn is creating an absolute fiscal nightmare for state budgets. The states administering the program are getting squeezed from both sides.
They are, and this stems from a major, under-discussed funding shift in the new legislation. Historically, the federal government pays for the actual food, the dollars loaded onto the EBT cards, but the administrative costs, the salaries of the caseworkers, the call centers, the software that was split 50-50 between the federal government and the state.
But the new bill alters that formula.
Drastically. Starting in October 2026, the federal government is scaling back its administrative support. States are going to be forced to absorb 75% of the administrative costs of running the SNAP program.
That is a massive hit to state legislatures.
And it comes with a punitive kicker. The federal government evaluates states on their payment error rates. Basically, they audit the state to see how often caseworkers give someone too much or too little money based on the complicated eligibility math. If a state's error rate creeps over 6%, the federal government heavily penalizes them, forcing the state to pay a portion of the actual food benefits out of their own treasury.
Oh, wow. So states are terrified. If they make a mistake, it costs them millions, which creates this devastating paradox of strictness. To protect the state budget, state directors tell their caseworkers to be incredibly strict. Double-check every pay stub. Demand extra documentation for every medical claim. Don't approve a case unless the file is flawless.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, that strictness is the exact mechanism that causes churn. The caseworker demands a specific, hard-to-find document from a 62-year-old applicant.
Right.
The applicant can't produce it in time. The caseworker, terrified of an audit error, closes the case. But here is the ultimate irony. When that 62-year-old realizes their EBT card is empty at the grocery store, what do?
They reapply.
Exactly. They go right back into the system. And processing a brand new application from scratch is incredibly labor-intensive. State data shows that every time a case is closed due to churn and then reopened, it costs the state between $80 and $130 in administrative waste.
It is an absolute doom loop. The state is terrified of a 6% error penalty, so they make the application process draconian. That strictness forces eligible people off the program. Those people immediately reapply, which costs the state hundreds of dollars in administrative processing fees per person, fees that the state is now paying 75% of.
It's fiscal self-sabotage, and state administrators know it, which is why several state legislatures are currently scrambling to implement internal policy workarounds to protect their budgets and, their most vulnerable residents.
I was looking at some of these state-level life rafts, and they basically involve states trying to legally minimize how often they have to interact with their own participants. What are some of the major tools they're using?
Well, the most impactful tool is extending the recertification period. Instead of forcing an older adult on a fixed income to jump through these paperwork hoops every 6 months, federal law allows states to request waivers to extend that period up to 36 months for certain populations.
Which makes perfect logical sense. If your only income is a fixed Social Security check, your financial situation isn't going to radically change between March and September.
Right. It's stable. Another major initiative is called the Elderly Simplified Application Project, or ESAD. It targets populations over 60 who have no earned income. ESAT radically shortens the application form, completely waives the mandatory phone interview, and dramatically reduces the amount of secondary documentation a caseworker has to demand.
So it just removes the friction points where churn happens.
Exactly.
There's also something called the Standard Medical Deduction, the SMD, which addresses one of the most tedious parts of the eligibility math.
Yeah, this one is crucial for older adults and disabled individuals. Under SNAP rules, if you have high out-of-pocket medical expenses, you can deduct those from your income, which mathematically qualifies you for more food assistance. But historically, claiming the deduction meant you had to provide receipts for every single topay, every aspirin, every physical therapy session.
A nightmare for the applicant to hoard and a nightmare for the caseworker to audit.
Oh, totally. So the standard medical deduction creates a shortcut. If a participant can simply prove their medical expenses exceed $35 a month, the state stops asking for receipts and just grants a flat standard deduction, usually around $150 or $200 depending on the state. The caseworker doesn't have to do the arithmetic, and the applicant doesn't get their case closed because they lost a pharmacy receipt.
So, what does this all mean? Let's bring everything we've unpacked today into focus. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025 fundamentally rewired the mechanics of food assistance. By expanding the ABIWD work mandates to older adults up to age 64 and removing exemptions for veterans and unhoused populations, the law vastly expanded the number of people who have to constantly prove their worthiness to the system.
Right.
And by requiring a 10% unemployment rate for geographic waivers, it forced states to apply these strict rules almost universally, regardless of local economic realities.
And the cumulative effect of these demographic and geographic shifts has just supercharged the risk of administrative churn. It created a bottleneck where eligible people are losing their benefits, not because they don't need them, but because the system's demand for documentation has outpaced the individual's ability to provide it within these arbitrary 30-day windows.
Yeah, and understanding these hidden mechanics like the error rate penalties, the administrative cost shifts, the recertification timelines, it's just as crucial as knowing the text of the law itself. Because a law designed to provide a safety net means absolutely nothing if the website to apply for it keeps crashing, or if a misplaced piece of mail acts as a trap door.
Exactly.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. We live in an era of unprecedented data integration. The government already possesses vast cross-reference databases for Social Security, tax records, and employment history. State and federal agencies have the technological capacity to verify income and identity in milliseconds.
Yeah, the technology is all there.
So as these data systems become increasingly advanced and interconnected, why does the ultimate burden of proof and the devastating risk of a paperwork failure continue to fall squarely on the shoulders of the most vulnerable individuals rather than the systems designed to serve them?
It really raises an important question about the architecture of our institutions. Are we building systems optimized to deliver aid, or systems optimized to enforce compliance?
The structural ropes of the safety net are moving and the holes are changing shape. Keep your eyes on the net. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.